Hello everyone and welcome to another video on Python. In this video we're going to discuss for loops and while loops, but in their basic form. In Python there's a few ways of implementing while loops and they're all pretty neat. It makes things much more streamlined and it increases the ease of use. So for this example I'm just going to create a list called breakfast. And it'll be a list of some pretty fun stuff to have during breakfast. I like pancakes. We will also have bacon. Pancakes are even better when we're mixing bacon and pancakes. And then we'll also have syrup to make our pancakes just a little bit smoother, sweeter. Syrup. And lastly, we'll have some coffee to provide us the energy that we will need for the day. Okay, so here's our list. Now, let's say now I want to print the contents of the list. Well, if I print it, it doesn't look as pretty. You know, we have the quotation marks and we have, the square brackets, the commas. It's not very pleasing. So you know what? Why don't I do this? Why don't I use a for loop to go and iterate through the entire contents of the list. So what I'll do here is I'll say for I in breakfast. And now you're thinking, well, what does this mean? Well, for I in breakfast means for each item inside of the breakfast array. So this is going to iterate from the beginning of the breakfast list to the end of the breakfast list. And the in keyword will specify and do all the hard work to make sure that this for loop iterates from the beginning of the list to the end of the list. So all I have to do here is print I, and I actually want the end to be spaced out. And here I'll print just an empty string so that we can have that new line. Now, something to notice is that how can I tell there's something inside of my while loop? Well, it's indented. So in Python, we don't have any curly braces to show the scope of our for loop as we would in C and C++. And as a result of that, when we create for loops and while loops, and in later lectures, an if statement, else or else if statement, we know that the contents of the for loop or while loop or if else statements, they're inside of it when it's indented. So we know that this print I is inside of this for loop because it's indented. This print on line 22, even if it's right here, even if it's right here, right under it, we know that the print statement on line 21 is not inside of the for loop because it is not indented. So how do we begin the body of a for loop? Well, instead of using a curly brace, as we would here, instead of using a curly brace, as we would here, right, if this was C, we would be we begin our if statement just with that colon. Just with that colon, right? So in theory, this is what it'll look like. But just with this colon, this is what really begins our statement. So after this colon, anything that's indented is going to be considered part of the if statement. Since the print statement on line 22 is not indented, well, it's not part of the for loop. So we will not print breakfast the ugly way. We'll print it using a for loop. Now this looks much better. So with this in keyword, you might be thinking, well, is there another way of printing breakfast? What if, I just came from C and C++ and, I feel a lot of affinity for it. Well, there's a way of printing it that way too. And here's the example. We can say for J in the range of the length of breakfast. Okay, So, this is a new keyword, and we'll cover in the next video on what range means and how we can go about using it and using it to our benefit, not just in for loops, but for things in general. Should be J. Okay. So for here, we'll also print J. So we'll print. No, we'll have a separate for loop that'll do this. So I'll copy this, and after we print our items for breakfast, I'm going to call this K instead. We're just going to print K. Just that way we see the contents of range. But again, we'll cover this in more detail in our next video. So for here, we're going to have for J in a range of length breakfast, and we're going to print breakfast, right? We're going to access breakfast normally as we would a list, using J to access each specific element. So let's run that. So, actually, that's not good. That's nasty. We're going to have a end that's going to be equal to just the space. And same thing when we print with K. So end equals, right? This makes sure that the end of each print statement, rather than being a new line, is just the space. And here I'm printing an empty string just so that way we can add that new line. Right? So this looks much better. So here we use this for loop to print every single item inside of the list one at a time by using the in keyword. So for I in breakfast here, we first start with pancakes, and then which is the beginning of the list, and we iterate through the list until finally we reach the end, and this knows when to stop. Now, when we use for J in range of the length of breakfast, what we end up doing, and you can see the output of J and K of our iterator that's being used to access the list, is that this is numbers. So since the length of breakfast is 4, we're going to iterate from 0 through 3. And this makes sense here because when we do breakfast as 0, because 0 is the first element of this list, we're going to print pancakes, right? And 1 is the index of the second item of the list, which is bacon. It prints correctly. So there's a one-to-one correlation between the index here and it printing the correct index of the list. So this is pretty great. You can use for loops to see the contents of an array, and you can use for loops as you would a normal application in C or C++ to do something repeatedly. And this could be an algorithm seeing the contents of a list and so on. Now, while this is pretty different from what you would see in C and C++, this might be a fair amount to take in. However, for while loops, the case is not so the same. For while loops, it is much more closer to C and C++. It's very, very similar. If I'd like to print numbers between 1 and 10 using a while loop, I can just create something, say count equals 1. And I can say while count is less than 11, print count. We'll give it an end of a space. And like with while loops in C, we need to manually increment count so that way we reach the exit condition. Right, so for those who are very similar in C and C++, this would be our starting condition. This right here will be our ending condition while count is less than 11. So once it reaches the number 11, we're done. And here's going to be our step. How we're going from our starting condition to our ending condition. And here's just the body of the code. Right, so this looks very, very similar to a while loop in C. And the thing here is that this follows the same rule as the for loop, right? We begin the body of the code of our while loop with the colon, and then whatever's inside of the while loop, it is indented, right? Notice that on lines 32 and 33, the Python statements there are indented. Okay? Now, something that I'd like to do for this next example is to have a nested for loop, right? So this is a case of just one, right? These are just one for loop, one type of loop in a sequence. But if I'd like to have a loop within a loop, well, here's the way of doing it. So one thing is that I'm going to print to make sure everything's nice and easy on the eyes. And actually, before we do that, let's run our program. So here, our while loop goes from 1 to 10, and it is reflected here, which is pretty good. Well, actually, it's reflected here. I should probably print another. Let's clean up that code. And let's run it again. Right, so here's that for loop that prints the range, and here we have the while loop that goes from 1 to 10. So this all is appearing to work how we expect it to work. Right, so now why don't we try a nested for loop? So in this nested for loop, the objective is I'd like to have a row of numbers that are the squared numbers going from 1 to 10. So first what I will do is I'll say count, I will reset count equal to 1. And you know what, let's do something similar to what we did with our first while loop. So while count is less than 11, well, I want to set up my second condition for my inner while loop, so that I can multiply my count number with another number, which is itself. So I will create mult as a coefficient to multiply your count, and I'll set it equal to count. And I'll say while mult is equal to count, I'm going to print count times multiplier. No, count times mult, not multiplier. And because this is a while loop, I need to change mult. Right, I need to add my stepping condition. And here, I'm going to add my stepping condition for count. Right, so now this is a little bit more intricate because we have our while loop, right, and then we begin it with our colon, and now look, this is indented, right? So I begin another while loop, which is right here. But look, now this is unindented by 1. So this count statement is not inside of this while loop, but is instead inside of this while loop, right? So we have our outer while loop and we have our inner while loop. And in our outer while loop, we have mult equals count, this while loop, and count plus equals 1, right? This is part of the outer while loop. What is part of the inner while loop is this print statement and incrementing our mult variable, which is pretty neat, right? So again, this isn't part of the this inner while loop because it's not indented twice. It is just indented once. Let's run this code and see what happens. Hey, this is not too bad. This is exactly what we're looking for. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 2, and so on. Thank you for seeing this video on basic loops. In the next video, we are going to cover the range keyword and something that's a little bit more complicated, but is seen throughout Python and is considered, it's considered very fluent to know, right? If you're very fluent in Python, you should know this, and it is called list comprehensions. It'll use loops to create a list. It's very amazing. Anyways, thank you.